Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. The story of Lady Antonia Fraser is an inspiring one for all historians. She is the best-selling, but also the best-reviewed and most successful historian of the post-war era. And so it's a tremendous honour for us here at our inaugural festival to have the #1 historian in Great Britain. I'm going to talk to her about her life in books, which actually starts as this wonderful autobiography ends. And that's, of course, going to be sold at the bookshop on the corner there by John Sandow, as is her fascinating diary of her visit to Israel in 1978 with her husband, Harold Pinter. So I'd like to start by asking you, Antonia, what it was like growing up in a political household. It's often thought that you grew up in a literary household because, of course, your parents both did write books, but actually they were first and foremost politicians, weren't they?
Very much so. My mother, who became an extremely famous writer as Elizabeth Longford, was inspiring in a completely different way because she wrote her first proper book when she was almost 60, which I think says it for, anybody older. It's never too late. But actually, in my childhood, they were very much politicians. My father stood for Oxford. My mother stood for Cheltenham and Oxford on another occasion. And I grew up thinking canvassing was the greatest fun because I'm very inquisitive, as biographers and historians should be. And for me to be allowed, when I was quite young, to go and knock on doors and say, I'm Frank Pakenham's little girl, can I come in? And looking round and sort of, patting the dog and all. Dog, you had to be jolly careful that the dog didn't pat back, which they very often did. But I really enjoyed it. And I think I also discovered from canvassing early disillusionment with human nature. Everyone was very nice to me. Nobody's nasty to children canvassing. And incidentally, I doubt if I'd be allowed to go canvassing
on your own as a
on
child.
my own
No,
now today. All I
so.
can say is I enjoyed it. And everybody was really nice. And then at the end, I knew what I said. And I said, and I do hope you will vote for my father on Thursday. Oh, no, we always vote Tory. Your father is a really nice man, and it's been very nice to meet you. So I'd have to go back to the political office, and they say, Labour? I say, well, I know, not exactly.
You knew Clement Attlee, in whose ministry your father served in the great 1945 to 51 government.
Mr. Attlee, I never could think of him as Clement Attlee. He was Mr. Attlee. And we went, there were sort of Christmas, New Year, Boxing Day, I think probably Boxing Day, parties at Chequers when he was Prime Minister. And again, I was a bit old. I was the oldest of the family. And I was a bit old. I was slightly outside the age limit, but sense of history, I had to go. And I was rewarded in the hall at Chequers. There was a huge screen, sort of Chinese screen. This is 1946 or 7. And from behind the screen, out stepped a small Japanese gentleman dressed as Father Christmas. And it was Mr. Attlee, who did have an extremely Japanese look. He was very distinguished looking. And he was dressed up as Father Christmas. And this was an awesome sight, which I'm glad to say I went back and wrote in my diary the following eloquent sentence, which seemed to me magic, deserved publication. I saw Mr. Attlee dressed as Father Christmas. End.
What made you want to become a historian?
I just was. When I was born, I said, bring me a pen and pencil and I'll describe the experience. Andrew, you have it too. You have it too. I've got an irresistible impulse to write it down, to describe it. And it isn't exactly or either you either have it or you don't, because people can develop it. But I always did have it. And so I didn't want to be a writer. I was a writer. The next question is whether you're a good writer. And I don't think anyone's born a good writer, but that may not be true. Maybe Charlotte Bronte was born a good writer.
What do you think made you a good writer?
I think lack of money was helpful.
Yes, I know exactly what you mean. And your education, of course. You had a first-class education. You enjoyed your school.
I was very
lucky.
lucky.
About rugby, and not the school rugby, but playing rugby.
I didn't go to the school rugby. No, my father was a don at Oxford in my youth, and we lived next door to the Dragon School, which then took very few girls, but some girls in the war. Anyone here at the Dragon School? Oh, good. Then I can describe my prowess on the rugby field without fear of contradiction. And girls, there were about 30 girls and 350 boys, and girls were just treated exactly the same. We had a different changing room, and it's rather interesting to remember that we girls were always having dares to get into the boys' changing room. No boy showed any interest in getting into the girls' changing room. Anyhow, I had all the best parts in the school plays because there were so few girls, and I played rugby, which I still think, I call it rugger actually, I still think is a wonderful game. And I got a first-class education, which really enabled me to coast along for most of the rest of my school time, because it was so heavily taught, sort of ingrained. I mean, I can still use the Latin I learned at the Dragon School.
And when you went to Oxford, you were there in something of a golden age, weren't you? Lord David Cecil, Maurice Bowrer, these giants were still there at the time, and you knew.
Oh, very much so. I mean, they weren't. Of course, I didn't. I mean, I'd grown up with them in Oxford.
Yes.
And to me, they were very nice people. David Cecil was really charming man. I'll give you an example. I was asked to a dinner when I first went to Oxford. Very grand dinner given by Hugh Trevor Roper, who knew my father at Christchurch. He obviously thought he'd do that for me, my first term, and asked me, and I was sort of ill-fitted to it, but I wasn't dressed quite right. And anyhow, the last person to sit down was David Cecil, and so he sat in the empty place, which was, guess what, next to me. And as he sat down, he said, "I had hoped for this." And it was just such a charming thing to say. Azar Berlin, again, charming, though you had to listen very hard because he talked so fast. Did you know him, Andrew?
Yes, I did, yes, he did talk fast.
He did, yeah.
Yes. He said to me one thing, I remember when I was having a drink with him in his rooms in Albany, which has stuck with me ever since, and is a very powerful. He was talking about what would have happened if the Germans had won the war,
Interesting.
and what if they'd invaded Britain successfully, and I said, well, who would have collaborated? And he said, it's easily the most vicious game an Englishman can play.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a fascinating game, isn't it? I mean, I didn't obviously play it at the time, but ever since I've sort of wondered. And
Yes.
And I'm very interested in the subject of sort of the wretched French women who collaborated in the sense that they had a German boyfriend,
Yes,
and I just sort of wondered if I'd had children in the war and I needed food for them, would I really?
The extent to which
Yes.
you would be willing to go.
Yeah.
Yes,
I think you have to ask yourself.
Yes, no, those moral questions are the kind of questions that historians should ask themselves,
Yes.
even though,
Yeah.
of course, they are counterfactual.
Yeah.
But you're not a ideological opponent of counterfactual history like some people are.
Andrew, you edited a wonderful book which I think was called What If?
And you contributed to it.
Yes, thank you. I hope
it was
you say
it was
that.
what's called a leading question, Antonio. And you've
Actually, it's a frightfully good. I found my copy the other day. I did. Now, correct me, Andrew. The rules of counterfactual. What if? are that it must be something that would have been possible.
And only one thing. You can't then change hundreds of different things. You know, is what would have happened if that one thing had changed.
Yes.
And you did what if the Spanish Armada had been successful?
No,
Gunpowder Plot.
Gunpowder. And Somerset did the Spanish Armada. I did the Gunpowder Plot, which simply depended on the gunpowder not being found and going off, at which point the plotters would have grabbed young Princess Elizabeth, who was in the Midlands. The others would all have gone up in the House Lords, alas, the other royal family, and they would have grabbed her as planned, made her queen. We would have had Queen Elizabeth II, sort of 400 years earlier. And I proceeded from that point of view, that allowing a prince, little Prince Charles, to escape with a courtier back to Scotland. He becomes King of Scotland. Finally, they fight each other. He's grabbed and executed in 1649, exactly as actually happened.
Which brings us obviously also onto your great first book and the one which really made your name as an historian, Mary Queen of Scots. Published in 1969, virtually in print the entire time ever since, an extraordinary, translated into every language you can think of. How would you approach writing that book any differently today if you were to rewrite, or if it was the first time you were to write Mary Queen of Scots, or do you think it would be word for word the same as you wrote in 1969? Is there any element that you think that you'd have exaggerated more or concentrated on less?
It's a very good question. Actually, in 1980, what would it have been? In 1987, which would have been the anniversary of her execution, I was allowed to read it through and re-edit it if I wanted to. And I just didn't want to touch it. I didn't feel that I'd missed anything, you know. And I didn't feel I would have done it better because I wrote it. I mean, I was very strict with myself with references, you know, and proofs and everything. But I think that it is, in a way, a limited subject in the sense that 19 years of it are in captivity. And I think that I covered that and the very short years of reign. So I don't think today I would do it any different. I mean, my next book, Cromwell, I think because I wrote it at a moment when there was a temporary lull in what we could call the Troubles, I think I was a bit too kind to Cromwell in Ireland. I am Anglo-Irish, but I don't think that prejudiced me. I just think that I wasn't sufficiently understanding at that moment. But then, of course, if I read it again now, I might think, you know, that I got it right. But I think one doesn't always get things right. I'm leaving aside mistakes, and everybody makes mistakes, and the only thing to do about mistakes is apologise and correct them as soon as possible.
Yes,
do,
of course.
Do you ever make mistakes, Andrew?
All the time,
I don't believe it.
One thing that you did look into carefully in Mary Queen of Scots was her religion, was the importance of her religion to her. Obviously, that's also equally true of Cromwell and of Charles II and of many of your subjects. Religion is obviously a tremendously powerful political force in all of their lives. But what part does it play in yours?
Well, I've had, in a mini way, quite a journey. I was born Church of England, though my mother was born a Unitarian from the Chamberlain family and abandoned Unitarianism when she was 18. And my father was just Church of Ireland or Church of England. Neither of them took much interest. When my father became a Catholic in 1940, my mother remained anti-Catholic because of the Spanish Civil War, put rather crudely. She became a Catholic in 1946. Then I was offered the chance, and I became a Catholic. So I was 14 before I became a Catholic. And I think the fact that I had seen the other side of it, seen another religion and how Catholics were described, and seen how Catholics were described once I was a Catholic. I think that's been very useful to me.
And it's
personally.
quite unusual to convert at 14, isn't it? Some people, quite a lot of people are born, and some people in later life
Yes.
convert. But to convert at that age, I think, is quite an unusual.
I think it is quite
then.
unusual. My children are all cradle Catholics. Their father was a Catholic, and we all know many famous converts. You know, like Graham Greene, Evelyn Waugh. You know, later. I think it was just the odd circumstances. I'd always wanted to be a Catholic. I wanted to go to Mass with my father. I liked exactly the smells and bells, you know, that people talk about. So 14, there I was, and I was offered just to be sort of flipped over into the Catholic Church, and I did insist on having a full conversion reception ceremony in the chapel at St Mary's Ascot, so everyone could see me. I was then told I didn't need to do a confession, because undoubtedly I had no sins. They'd just take it for granted. I said, not at all. And I insisted on going into the vestry and confessing while the school sat like you're sitting, thinking, what on earth? And Father Godfrey, who was a very nice man, said, well, dear, there doesn't seem to be much. What was this about eating more Brussels sprouts than you were allowed? I think you've said that twice already. And finally, I went back, the redeemed sinner.
Religion and Charles II. You have a specific view on that you brought out in your book, didn't you?
Well, I think that Charles II was someone who he wasn't religious in the sense that we might use the term today, but I think the circumstances of his upbringing, a Catholic mother, never forget, people do forget, Henrietta Marat was a Catholic and remained so. A father, not Catholic, not at all, but executed by, as he thought, sort of Puritans. He's then on his travels in Catholic countries, and I think he comes back to England determined in 1660, determined never to go on his travels again, as people used to say. But I think he retained a feeling that the Catholic religion, if any, was the one. In the meantime, he sowed royal wild oats like nobody's business. But at the very end, when death was coming, then I think it was a quick but genuine deathbed conversion. I don't think he was an actual Catholic all his life, as some people think.
So I'm trying to think of something that connects Mary Queen of Scots, Marie Antoinette, who you also wrote about tremendously successfully, Guy Fawkes, at least posthumously, Oliver Cromwell, and a couple of Henry VIII's wives, about whom you also have written very extensively. And the only thing that I can see together makes me ask, Lady Antonia, what is it about decapitation that interests you quite as much as it clearly does?
Well, Andrew, I suppose if you put it like that, as only you would, I suppose if a woman puts her head above the parapet, the odd chance.
Especially if you're married to Henry VIII.
Exactly.
Yes. The book about Marie Antoinette was perhaps wasn't one of your most passionate books, I would say. You did feel that this woman had been vilely traduced, and especially obviously after the revolution, but also with the various rumours and things before the revolution. Speak a bit about your sort of connection with Marie Antoinette.
Funnily enough, when I began to do the book, I had a sort of inspiration in a taxi. I was going to advise my goddaughter, Helen Fulkers, what to do about A-level. Between my house and the restaurant, I suddenly thought, I'll do Marie Antoinette. So I arrived and said, sorry, Helen, we're not going to talk about your A-level, we're going to talk about my next book, Marie Antoinette. And we did. And I went home and picked up my diary, and I saw it was October the 16th, tomorrow, the anniversary of the execution of Mary Queen of Scots. Sort of odd, I like historical dates.
And decapitation.
exactly. But I began just thinking, you know, she was an interesting, tragic woman, and it was only studying her properly that I realized that she'd been introduced, that this whole French picture of her as this frivolous and extravagant woman is absolute nonsense. She never said, "Let them eat cake." That was said about 100 years before by Princess of Spain, Marie-Thérèse, who married Louis XIV. It's just simply got, you know, clipped to her. Not true. She was much more like Princess Diana. She would have given them her cake. You know, that was much more her nature, sort of stopping peasants in the park and pressing things on them. But she also, I disliked the French tradition of la reine méchante. You know, what did she ever do that was méchante, quite frankly? And the way they fixed on her, because she was Austrian, and made her a sort of scapegoat, which I think people would agree. And this really came to me through research. I had a very interesting time. I spent, well, obviously there's not much research to be done in England other than the British Library, but I spent a great deal of time in France. Harold was directing and then putting on plays of his. We had a most sort of, one of my daughters had just married a Frenchman, and we had a most harmonious time. I loved researching in the Bibliothèque Nationale and the Archives Nationales. And I think one of my great moments was when I discovered there was a wardrobe book. Now, a wardrobe book is open like that, and it has swatches of material, sort of 6 or 8, and the Queen then chooses 3 for that day, or 4 of the dresses, with an iron nail. We know she did this because these nails have been found at Versailles. We thus know, you know, exactly where she slept. Anyhow, the open wardrobe book is actually about the size of this table. And I sat there in the Archives Nationales, which is in the Rue Franc-Bourgeois from memory. First of all, they made me put on white gloves, which for Marie Antoinette seemed so extraordinarily appropriate, although it was for conservation reasons, in case my hideous sort of sweat would get on. And it's the only one that survived. All the others were burnt by the revolutionaries. Must have been, I believe, 1 for each year or something. And then it was brought in to me, not by a sort of administrator, I was sitting there, but by 2 gendarmes, both of whom were armed, you know, French police, armed. And I thought, I know what I'm going to do. You know, when you go up the Leaning Tower of Pisa, you want to jump off, you can't help it. I sort of wanted to fudge it somehow, this terrible devil, you know. And I thought, I can't pick up, obviously I wasn't allowed a pen, but I can't pick up a pencil because I might do something. I don't trust myself. I sat there like a sort of dog. And the moment they took it away, then the administrator did want to come and talk to me. But I said, I've got to write it all down. You know, great experience.
Let's move on to the other book that you've recently published, Our Israeli Diary, the trip in 1978 to Israel.
Yeah.
There's a particular line in it that I thought was fascinating, where Harold Pinter says to you, "I now feel that I am Jewish. I understand that I am Jewish. I now feel it," was the exact quote, I think. Tell us a bit about Harold's connection with Judaism.
Yes, that sentence was absolutely true, and I found fascinating at the time. So I wrote it down as I did. It may sound odd, well, because Harold was 1,000%, 1,000,000% Jewish. Grew up knowing he was Jewish, extremely proud of it. Orthodox Jewish parents, and although he abandoned the religion, he distinguished very sharply between that and being Jewish. And growing up in Hackney after the war, got into many fights because there were Mosleyite marches immediately after the war, which I find very odd, but is true, you know, lots of evidence for it. So he was very proud, but he just took it for granted. I think that's what he meant. That's what he was. You know, some people have blue eyes, other people have black eyes. He never really thought about it as such, beyond getting very angry if anybody insulted Jews, you know, as happened once or twice in pubs or something. And I think that going to Israel made him think much more deeply and seriously, something he'd taken for granted. And I think that was wonderful, you know, that should have happened.
Mm. I mean, when you went to Israel, it was only 30 years after the creation of the state.
Yes.
What was Israel like in 1978? And tell us also about some of the people you met there, because you were very fortunate to have had a swathe of some of the most brilliant Israeli intellectuals of the day.
Well, I think the most famous person now that we met, but he wasn't in office at the time, was Shimon Peres, the future Prime Minister and then President. I had an introduction to him from my great friend and first and only employer, George Weidenfeld. May he rest in peace.
May he rest in peace.
And who gave me wonderful introductions. And Shimon Peres, he was so interesting. Now, he would have been like a Don at Oxford. He would have fitted perfectly. He was tremendously distinguished in this sort of library, you know. I admired him. I met him again later when he came to London, but I've always been grateful of having had that glimpse of him.
And Teddy Kollek as well, you
Absolutely.
knew?
Teddy Kollek, the marvellous mayor, who was again a great friend of George's, and a lot of sort of Israeli people, the people who know Israel, recognised the names.
What was your sense of the country, of this young, sort of almost nascent land?
It was tremendously exciting, the energy. I think that what really didn't make much sense to me until I went there was the scale of it all, how near everything is. It was rather in a way like going to Northern Ireland, where you suddenly find that you know, that the famous Protestant roads are bang next door to the famous Catholic roads. You know, I'm sure.
Course, yes,
and it gives you a great shock, because reading the newspaper, you think they're sort of miles apart. No, I think that, you know, Jackie Kennedy happened to be on a visit when we were there by complete chance, who I knew. And she was with Mayor Teddy Kollek at a sort of dinner or reception, and she was looking out into the city, and she kept saying in that marvellous voice, "Is that an Arab? Is that a Jew?" And people mocked her for asking, but actually it was a perfectly good question, because they were so mixed up, you know. And Jackie had the sort of intelligence to know she didn't know.
You mentioned George Weidenfeld, who of course is buried on the Mount of Olives.
Yes.
Your only employer, but somebody who did publish a large number of your books, all of your books. Tell me about him. I mean, obviously he was my publisher as well, so I have a very strong and tremendously fond appreciation of him. But you knew him for 60 years almost.
Over, yes.
I was being generous there. Trying to be anyway, Antonio.
Do you know how I got my job?
Yeah, no, tell us.
I tell you how I got my job.
Yeah.
In no way do I come from a privileged circle or an elite or anything like that. My mother wanted me to go into the Foreign Office, and I would have been a disastrous diplomat. And they only took girls till they married in those days. Can you imagine today? Hoofing girls out from the Foreign Office when they got married. Anyway, I don't know when it changed, but it did. Anyway, I didn't want to do that, and so I was looking for a job, and I needed a job at once. And my mother sat next to George Weidenfeld at a dinner, and George, to make conversation, said, "I'm looking for a girl to come and be an editor in parallel to Nicholas Thompson, who's a young man from Cambridge who was coming. And she's got to be speak fluent German, French and Italian, and probably Sanskrit or something. Absolutely impeccable shorthand, typing, very good people management skills, to be really terribly attractive and also well dressed. My mother said, "Say no more. My daughter Antonia is the one for you." And George told me later, I mean, he became one of my closest friends, he was slightly surprised she didn't pretend to offer about 5 people, you know. Anyway, I joined doing everything that Nicholas Thompson didn't in a tiny office in Cork Street, and had the most wonderful time, because George, as I like to say, was my university. Although I'd been at Oxford, George introduced me to the idea of European culture, which as a wartime child, I'd no idea, you know, apart from speaking fluent German, I learnt it. None of us could speak any languages at all, even though we learnt them on the page. And he was so exciting. He'd go out to lunch every day and come back about four books in his beak, you know. And then one day we used to print classics, heirloom classics, for the heirloom library in Marks and Spencer. The point being that they were free, no copyright, because they were classics, authors long dead. And we took all the money, and they were sold in thousands in Marks and Spencer. And that really kept the young Weidenfeld Nicholson going. So George comes back, and normally he comes back and says, "We'll do this, we'll do that, we'll do Children of the New Forest, you know, we'll do this, that." And one day he came back and he said, "We'll do King Arthur and the Knights Round Table." And I was longing to say something. I could never think of anything to say. So I piped up and said, "Oh, George, you can't do that. No child could read Thomas Malory, possibly, and T.H. White is very much in copyright." And he didn't pause. He said, "Then you, Antonia, will write it." And he just went on to the next book. So I thought, all right. And so I wrote my first book, King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, at night, not in office hours, pretty late. It was an enormous bestseller, as actually, frankly, every heirloom book was, closely followed by Robin Hood. And those were my first 2 books.
Fantastic. Did you also meet some of George's other authors? He had a wonderful panoply of great writers in those days, didn't he?
Well, when I came in 1953, he was just at the end of having boldly published German authors, including not exactly ex-Nazis, but people who'd been perhaps in German positions of command.
I think Albert Speer can be called an ex-Nazi.
Yes, yes, exactly. I was thinking of Dönitz, actually.
Yes.
Is Dönitz a Nazi?
Not really, no.
No. That was my... You know how accurate I am.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But Speer was the one that he made the huge success
Yes.
with.
Okay, Speer, who was a Nazi. I quite agree. But George had the courage to say, "Hey, I'm Jewish and I'm going to take advantage of that. There have been disadvantages." And he published them. And so that was and he then published a book by Isaiah Berlin, The Hedgehog and the Fox. It's a famous little philosophic book.
Yeah.
And he did the anthology of Horizon magazine for Cyril Connolly, who was then his friend. He subsequently married Connolly's wife. They weren't so friendly.
No,
And then
Barbara Skelton. We can talk about her in a second, actually. Not least because she once made a pass at me.
Andrew?
Yes, I know. She also was the mistress...
Wait a moment. Can I ask what your answer was?
Irritatingly, in those days, I didn't have the chutzpah to say how... I mean, if I'd known then, when I was 21 years old and she was 71, what I know now, I would, of course, been able to have said that I slept with the mistress of King Farouk and the wives of Cyril Connolly and George Weidenfelder. It would be something that I would love to be able to say, but infuriatingly, I'm afraid I can't. Did you know Barbara Skelton at all? Well,
of course. I couldn't say she didn't like women, younger women. When she was married to George, first of all, the night George met her properly, having not liked her, he took me out with John Sutro, and George on the way said, John Sutro is bringing that tiresome Barbara Skelton. And I said, oh, really, not very interested. We all went to the Milroy, I think, or Les Ambassadeurs, the sort of place you went to. And at some point, completely unnoticed by me, on the dance floor, Barbara Skelton succeeded in doing to George Weidenfeld what she failed to do to you. But I didn't know. And on the way back, George gallantly dropped me back in Chelsea. And I only knew later that I think when he got back at his house, the telephone was ringing, and it all began like that. They did get married. She left Cyril, they got married. By this time, I'm married to Hugh Fraser, and we used to go out our couch, and Barbara, just in order to keep her hand in, sort of, as it were, flirted with Hugh. And Hugh said, she's not in any way my type, but I just couldn't help it. I just sort of, I couldn't help responding. I saw the magic, even though, so she didn't like me and I didn't like her.
No, perfectly reasonable under those circumstances. Tell us about...
She wasn't very, she was extraordinary. She had the most beautiful, sinuous figure. I mean, really, even as a sort of jealous girl, I could see it was that.
Yeah.
Her face, I think, would be better now and better in photographs. She didn't have a very good skin, which was considered to be, I think we people who thought we had good skins thought it was more attractive than it was, I mean, who worried about her skin?
Let's move on from Barbara Skelton and talk instead about the Elizabeth Longford Historical Biography Prize, which you and your daughter Flora Fraser, who's also a tremendously successful historian and a brilliant writer, have set up. I was very honoured to sit as a judge on it, a quondam judge for some time. Can you tell us about the process of choosing a really good history book, because the only books that have won this prize have been fantastic, first-class pieces of work?
My daughter, Flora Fraser, was very close to her grandmother, and she used to, because she worked on various periods which coincided with those of my mother, and she very late on drove my mother to Windsor, and was there when my mother opened the chairlift going up to the library in the tower at Windsor. And so when my mother died, peacefully at the great age of 96, Flora decided to found this Historical Biography Prize, the ELHB. It was specifically not literary biography, because my mother felt literary biography was getting all the attention. I mean, this is my mother's view. So that biographies of hard ear, as it were, not eligible, however good. Andrew, you were on it. Were you from the beginning?
Yes, for about 10 years.
Yes, absolutely. It was awkward for Andrew because he might have come up as a potential winner.
Thank you for saying that.
We select books for a long list. Books are not submitted, and we have a long list meeting, and there are 5 of us so that we can sort of vote. And we have really good discussions about what is a historical biography, because it's easy to rule out literary biography. But for instance, one year, were you there when Pugin won? Pugin? No. Rosemary Hill's marvellous book on Pugin. And we had a really good debate, a proper debate, not an argument, about whether Pugin was a historical figure. I was of the party which maintained he was, and I'm very glad we won. What do you think? Do you think?
Yes, I do think he is. The other judges, Roy Foster's was one, A.N. Wilson, of course. Yes. The to and fro, the intellectual debate, was one of the great pleasures.
Well, I remember when Andrew Wilson was on it, he got awfully annoyed because I was chairman, in order to distinguish between the 2 Andrews, I took to calling on Andrew Rex. That was you. Do you remember? Andrew W. didn't like that.
Right, we're going to throw open the discussion to the audience, please. Can you wait for a microphone? Put your hand up if you'd like to ask a question. Wait for the microphone to come to you and ask Antonia anything you like. I can't believe that was such a totally comprehensive talk that there isn't any question at all. Lady at the back there. Sorry, maybe a gentleman. Sorry, lady at the back, yeah.
I'm a teacher, and I was interested in what you think of how history is taught today.
Is it possible to ask her to stand up?
Yes, could you stand up and
is it possible?
talk more into the microphone?
Okay,
Thanks
is that
very much.
better?
That's much better, thank you.
I'm a teacher, and I'm interested in your view of how history is taught today in schools, and any advice you'd have for young historians.
One of my granddaughters, Atlanta Fitzgerald, has just finished doing Teach First, teaching history. You know what I mean by Teach First? Yeah, she was teaching in Southall, and she was teaching history. And to be honest, I was more interested in learning how she was approaching it, you know. But from my own children, she's obviously 2 generations down, they hit a time, in my opinion, when dates were going out of fashion. Now, I'll be quite honest and say I need dates, and they anchor me. And of course, you know, as children, we were sort of taught all those sort of rigmaroles to help you. But I just did find the lack of dates. One of my children didn't exactly ask me which came first, Charles I or Charles II, although I say he did. But it seems to me, I wouldn't presume to tell a teacher, and I think my only advice is so obvious that if you're interested, they will be, and it isn't always possible to be interested in something. When I was doing the economic policy of Charles II, towards the Dutch, I thought, this is boring me so much. What can I do? It's going to bore everybody, and yet it's rather important. My divine publisher, Christopher Forcas, worked for George Weidenfeld. He said, I'll write you a few sentences. So buried inside Charles II is a fascinating discussion of his economic policy, and I didn't write it.
And you were also, weren't you, a great proponent of H.E. Marshall,
yes.
The author of Our Island Story. Would you like to say a few words about how you managed to get that republished and what...
Well, I can't claim that. I wrote an introduction to it.
And it was...
No, I was given it for Christmas 1936, when I was 4 and a half. I was a very early reader. No credit to me, credit to my mother.
This is Our Island Story, the great book.
Yeah. And it went right out of fashion and became described as sort of a colonialist menace, which is actually, if you've actually read it, not true. Not all its sentences could be reproduced in the Daily Mail, but today, but actually the values, excellent. For instance, America working for independence. Of course they wanted to, you know, when they paid money, they wanted to have a say, you know, all good stuff. Peasants revolt, they were being very badly treated. Of course they revolted, you know, so it actually, I would still recommend it.
She was a New Zealander, wasn't she?
Yes, but trying to tell her children, or her grandchildren, about how it had been in her childhood. Henrietta Elizabeth Marshall. But that just...
Amanda is it?
Hello.
Yes, Amanda Foreman.
I just want to...
Hi.
Hello. Fascinating discussion. Thank you both very much. I just wanted to follow on from the question about dates to ask you about story and narrative.
Yeah.
Do you think it's coming back? Because I certainly remember a time where a child at school could read an entire book on some subject in history and at the end have no idea about the period they've just read.
Actually, and I know you're sort of the same age as some of my children, I quite agree with you, you know, and of course I thought that was deplorable. But may I say, Amanda Foreman, if you didn't recognise her, it was reading, I didn't know anything about this person, it was a proof, and I was reviewing it for the Literary Review, which reviews on proof. I had absolutely no knowledge, and when I read Georgiana, I thought, this is it, it's coming back, you know, telling the extraordinary story, and that's really true. And I wrote, did I call it mesmerising? I hope I did. It was mesmerising.
And it's for sale in the bookshop just over there.
I only get 10%. No, but actually, Bill, it really is true. But part of my enthusiasm for the book was that I thought, this is what I believe in, and thank goodness it hasn't gone away. But I mean, your point about not really understanding the narrative theme of history. However, I remember one of my daughters having done a sort of a theme, her history essay was about the history of, what is it called when you crack open the skull in the interest, making someone sane?
Trepanning.
Trepanning? Yes, she was doing a sort of theme about the history of trepanning, and she didn't know Charles I from Charles II, you know.
No, of course you're absolutely right. The reader wants to have a narrative structure, wants to know what happened next. And also it's truer to history, because Napoleon didn't wake up one morning and say, I'm now going to deal with the problems of church and state. He had a series of things that had happened in the past, that were happening in the present, and that he wanted to happen in the future, and therefore you have to talk about all of those.
Well, something I'm very keen on is what the person, each different person, what their memories would be. I don't mean their private memories, but their actual memories, as mine are the war, which must stamp me forever, you know. And I always work out, the book I've just finished coming out next year, I always work out what people could have remembered, particularly true with the French Revolution, how old people would have been at the time of the Revolution. And I think that sort of keeps you, as we all are. I mean, I'm both myself, daughter of Don, whatever, but I'm also someone who was 7 in 1939, and that is a very important fact about my biography. Now, if you turn to Marie Antoinette, she was very, she came from a country which had just been at war with France. So all her memories were of Austria saying, horrible frogs, you know. So I think I agree with you, and you're going to, as you do, carry the flag for it.
Another question. Do I see one that somewhere? Oh, yes.
Lady Antonia, is there a really great biography you wanted to write for years but haven't yet got round to doing?
I think there are people that I would love to have written about, which I was prevented by my own, I think, correct standards. I'd love to have written about Catherine the Great, but I don't have German, her first language, I think, or let alone Russian. I mean, I do know some German, but I don't trust my German. I need to be able to read the letters. But I think she's a marvellous subject. I mean, I read A Very Good Life by Robert Massey, I think.
And Simon Sebag Montefiore, hasn't he? Oh, no, that was Potemkin, the lover of...
No, Potemkin's a terribly good book, yes, but not Catherine.
No, you're quite right.
Yeah. And even after doing Marie Antoinette, I wouldn't have minded doing Maria Theresa. There, she not only... German was her language, obviously, but she spoke, apparently, a kind of idiomatic kind of German. When I encountered it with other German characters, I used to have to get a friend of mine, an Austrian, to sort of translate for me. So I have to be able to get close, you know. So those are two people. I've never done the latest date I've written about, other than memoirs, is 1832. And I think we're living in an age of Victorian biographies. Have you got one on Victoria coming out? Which
No.
should be miserable.
I'm just thanking my lucky stars you never wrote about Churchill. Any other? Let's Harry Mount on the front there.
Antonio, just reading the new biography of your uncle Anthony Pole by
Yes.
Hilary Spurling. It's very good. And it describes you going to live with the Poles when you're about 15. What sort of influence did his writing have on your books?
I think Anthony Pole's wife, Violet, was my father's sister, and his wife was your grandmother's sister. Yeah.
I'm not saying that the Cleveland Literary Festival is in any way incestuous.
Once you've worked out brilliantly, we're cousins. I loved Violet. She was a very kind woman. I'm once again the eldest of 8 children, and my mother, quite reasonably, when I was 15, she had a baby of 2 months. Sort of born when I was 15, my youngest brother, and Violet was, on the contrary, extremely interested in me. She only had 2 little boys, and I was a sort of daughter, I mean, I've been told this later, a daughter figure. I was very happy to be. Tony was beginning to write Dance to the Music of Time. We had to get out of the dining room after breakfast rather quickly, which I was just about as welcoming to getting out as any teenager. I did not realize a great work of literature was being written. So I wasn't influenced by his writing exactly, but I was tremendously interested by and influenced by his attention to literature, his preoccupation with books, his belief that books, mind you, they went to galleries all the time as well, but he believed that books really finally were the only thing that mattered, and as that's what I believed, it sort of encouraged me. He was also a man of great charm and humour, which I believe Hilary Spurling's biography captures myself. Do you?
Yeah, no, I'm halfway through. It's extremely good.
Yeah.
It's interesting because you having to leave the room while Anthony Pole is writing. Of course, you had 6 children growing up in your house while you needed to work between 9:30 in the morning and 12:30. One of your children, was it Rebecca, who put a funny sign on the door?
Natasha.
What did it read?
Natasha put a sign on the door, ill spelt. Nobody allowed in this room, not even yourself. Otherwise, no conversation, no pocket money, and worst of all, no mother. My children wickedly say that I had a sign, which I wrote, saying, only come in between 9:30 and 12:30 if you've broken a leg, otherwise keep out. I deny this strongly.
We've got time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. Anybody have anything to ask? Gentleman in the middle there. Thank you.
You've written about a very, very wide range of people. I'm interested in your emotional reaction to your subjects. Have there been ones, as you progressed, that you've really disliked? And has that influenced your approach to your writing?
If I found myself disliking a subject, I would stop doing the book. One subject I found myself bored by. A little way in, I'd done a bit of work. It was Queen Alexandra, wife of Edward VII. I thought she was fine, and when I read Georgina Batterscombe's biography a bit later, I didn't think I was wrong. She wasn't interesting enough, and I thought, you must stop, because if it doesn't interest me, it certainly won't interest the reader. If I disliked somebody, I would stop. People have questioned whether I disliked Oliver Cromwell. On the contrary, I was fascinated by him, and after doing Mary Queen of Scots, who was born queen at 6 days old, I wanted to do a self-made man, which he was, and man of high principle. So I couldn't. And I don't think someone who dislikes somebody, I don't think they should write the biography. I don't mean that. I agree there's a weakness in this, because is no one to write the life of Hitler? 1. Two, do we want someone who likes Hitler to write the life of Hitler? Probably not. And the life of Hitler, Ian Kershaw's life, Joachim West's life, both absolutely excellent. So I think what I'm really trying to say is I personally couldn't have done it.
Any more questions? Anyone who'd like to? Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to, if you could all stay seated on that side so that Antonia and I can get to the bookshop, that would be one thing. And another thing would be for you to give a round of applause to a living legend, Antonia Fraser.